Rosa Brooks is a professor at Georgetown University Law Center, a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, and a leading voice on national security and human rights. She's also a columnist for Foreign Policy and a must-read for those of us who work on counterterrorism issues. Her pieces enlighten, inform, and provoke. From April 2009 to July 2011, she worked at the Department of Defense as counselor to Undersecretary for Policy Michelle Flournoy. From 2005 to 2009, she was a columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Other previous positions include special counsel to the president at the Open Society Institute, associate professor of law at the University of Virginia, senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State, consultant for Human Rights Watch, and fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Over to you, Rosa.
Thanks, Elisa. Let's see, can you all hear me here? So I'm going to do exactly what I do when I teach classes at Georgetown and say to those of you who are over there in the back, you cannot hide from us. We would love it if you would get up and move over here because we can't see you because of this podium. And we would love it if some of you sitting, I see you, yes, I mean you, come on up over here so we want this to be as much of a conversation as possible, so we would love to have you all where we can see you and we can call on you, just like in law school classes. So I get to introduce David. Look, people are very poor students here. Come on over, thank you. I get to introduce David here, which will not take me as long because his accomplishments are so impressive that I don't need to mention very many of them to give you the idea here. David is a columnist for Reuters and The Atlantic. He was a longtime New York Times foreign affairs correspondent. He has twice won the Pulitzer Prize, and many of you may also know him for his brave reporting in Afghanistan, which led him to be kidnapped by the Taliban. And he was kidnapped and escaped after being held for about 6 months. So I actually am going to start off by, David, I know that this is what you're always asked about, and you probably have other things that you want to talk about, but listening to Susan Rice, listening to the previous panel, and thinking about the way the United States, the way we in the United States think of ourselves as champions of human rights and the way we are perceived by others who do not always necessarily see us the way we see ourselves. One of the groups of people who we rarely take seriously, we rarely think to ask ourselves what they really think about us because we assume that anything they say publicly is just PR, is just posturing. We don't ask our adversaries very much what they really think about us and what they really think about our human rights record. So you, not willingly, you spend a great deal of time talking to people who are top US adversaries, the Taliban, including in moments where they were relatively unguarded and we're not talking for the press or for the benefit of a public audience, but we're just talking amongst themselves and having conversations with you. How does the United States human record look from the perspective of Taliban foot soldiers and ordinary Taliban soldiers?
Well, first of all, thank you. And I want to urge you all to please ask Rosa questions as well. So, because I'm fascinated to hear her thoughts on all these issues. On the Taliban, to be fair to the Taliban, I was with sort of a more extreme group of Taliban. I was grabbed in Afghanistan and taken to the tribal areas of Pakistan and held by a faction known as the Haqqani Network. They worked very closely with Arab militants and Pakistani militants. Badruddin Haqqani, who was the main sort of kidnapper with me, in an effort to help my situation, a great and a brave reporter and a dear friend of mine named Carlotta Gall from the New York Times, who covered Afghanistan, sent the Taliban a copy of a documentary about abuses by US soldiers on Bagram Air Base called Taxi to the Dark Side. It won an Academy Award, and it was essentially a story Carlotta discovered of a taxi driver who was beaten to death by American soldiers on Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. I watched that video, this Academy Award-winning documentary where journalists are exposing the wrongdoings of the American government with the Taliban, with Badruddin Haqqani, a leader of the Haqqani Network. And broadly speaking, their view is that the U.S. is very hypocritical, that we have tremendous human rights and rights in general inside the United States, but we really don't care about that anywhere else in the world when it comes to any other nationality. I cannot emphasize enough how devastating the abuses in Bagram, and particularly the images from Abu Ghraib, were in terms of reinforcing this view of American hypocrisy and inconsistency when it comes to human rights. And the extreme side of it, where I did not have any sympathy at all with their views, was that there was no differentiation between me as a journalist and the American government. I remember I had one Taliban commander ask me who I voted for as president, and I lied and said I didn't vote. But he was sort of going to hold me accountable for every policy of the Obama administration if I had voted for him. So it goes from, I think, some arguably legitimate critiques of American policy to sort of really kind of irrational views of the U.S.
And a lot of your work is done in the Middle East, and you have a book called Beyond War, which I want to talk about a little bit. But as you travel, we've just heard British perspective, a Canadian perspective, as well as a U.S. perspective. As you travel in the Middle East, what's your sense? Is that view of the U.S. as extremely hypocritical? Is that a widely shared view, or is it more complicated than that, and depending on place to place?
I think it's complicated, but I think that this, not to the extreme that exists among the Taliban, but you'll hear it from Syrian refugees. I just did a long piece on John Kerry for The Atlantic, and I went with him to the Zatri refugee camp in Jordan, which is, I believe, now the second largest refugee camp in the world. And to sort of, John Kerry's a mixed character, but he insisted on going to this camp on a day he had some downtime, and he did meet with 6 Syrian refugees. It was in sort of a very controlled setting in an office. But this issue of hypocrisy came up, and in the Middle East, frankly, Israel always comes up as well. And Kerry sat there, and these 6 Syrians who were carefully selected were very blunt, very honest, very critical of the United States. And the strongest quote was from a woman who said, you show tremendous respect for Israel and Israeli lives. Can't you show that same respect for the lives of Syrian children? So it's a problem across the region.
So we have diplomats like John Kerry. We have Susan Rice as our national security advisor, and Susan Rice certainly is someone who has had a long-standing interest and commitment to human rights, and I think the same could be said of John Kerry. Is this perception of U.S. hypocrisy something that can be changed through smart diplomacy, or is there a limit to how much that can accomplish without much deeper policy changes here in the U.S.?
I want you to partly answer this as well. I mean, I think the biggest problem is our
I ask the questions around here.
This isn't a law school, somehow.
I know.
The biggest problem, I would say, is our counterterrorism policies. So it's secret detention. Again, this, I remember the Taliban. I remember saying to the Taliban, like, I came for an interview. I'm unarmed. I'm trying to get your story across. And they said, you've been holding Afghans without trial in Guantanamo Bay for, at that point, it was 9 or 10 years, and now it's many more. So. Detention in Guantanamo, covert drone strikes. Susan Rice, I guess, mentioned internet freedom, which surprised me given all of the online surveillance that the United States is carrying out. So we basically support human rights until it interferes with what we see as our counterterrorism priorities and the methods we're going to use to achieve it. And to ask you, from your time in the Pentagon, you were fighting for human rights, and yet there are military commanders saying, I have to act against these groups. They're threatening my troops. I have to carry out a drone strike. I have to carry out a raid in that Afghan home. How hard is it to have that conversation?
It's easier than you would think, but I think the policies aren't, for the most part, coming out of the Pentagon. It's actually been interesting in the last few years as my own conversations with military audiences, and it's changed just in the last few years. A few years ago, when I would talk about U.S. drone policy to military audiences, I would very often get a reaction when I would raise rule of law-based criticisms of, yes, but these are really bad guys. You know, you don't understand, these are really bad guys. And that's changed. Today, I actually very often hear very senior level as well as mid and junior level military folks saying, I'm really worried that our policy is adrift. I worry that we're achieving tactical successes at the cost of strategic failure. I worry that we are doing, and the old Donald Rumsfeld line, we're creating terrorists faster than we can kill them. And I think that there certainly is you have two different things going on at the same time, right? On the one hand, there is, I think, a real awareness and, in fact, a growing concern that I sense, at least from the military audiences I speak to, about a policy that's just adrift, that is sort of seizing these little targets of opportunity without much ability to evaluate the longer-term costs in terms of the precedents we set for other states that might want to behave similarly in ways that we're not going to like, to use it for outright political repression. There's a concern about the potential increase in anti-American and terrorist recruitment that occurs when someone is killed by a drone strike, by a US drone strike, et cetera. But at the same time, pushing against that, you've got this vast bureaucratic apparatus, which has been reconfigured over the last decade and change for the, not the sole purpose of counterterrorism, but that's sort of 80% of the raison d'etre of so much of our security establishment at this point. And the logic of that machine just kind of keeps on going no matter what. And so even though you have more and more people saying, gosh, does this make sense? As a military friend of mine says, drone strikes are a tactic in search of a strategy. It's not clear who, other than the president and a tiny number of other people, other than the president and maybe the CIA director, have any ability to stop this machine once it gets rolling, because the natural tendency of this bureaucracy is to sort of pop up targets and say, we found one, and then no one wants to be the guy who says, yeah, we found it, but we decided not to do anything about it. It's very hard to do that. So no, I think it's, bureaucracy does its thing.
Do you, and see, I get to reverse this. I hope, or I thought, and you were, I think, still in the administration at the time, I've talked about and would like to see drone strikes shifted over to the US military from the CIA. That a key part of the problem is that it's a covert program. It's sort of absurd at this point. Everyone knows we're carrying out these drone strikes. I mean, do you think that would make a difference? The Air Force has a procedure in Afghanistan to investigate claims of civilian casualties, pay compensation if that occurs. Does the military want to carry out drone strikes?
Well, I mean, your first question, would it make a difference to shift the program to the military? I think it would make some difference, but not as much as I think some people think. I think that the one thing that would make a difference is that the military, unlike the CIA, has really integrated laws of war and law of war training and JAG officers into targeting decisions at every level. And that set of questions about proportionality and necessity and distinguishing between civilians and combatants is, I think, much more second nature for the military. And as you say, they do have much clearer and somewhat more transparent processes. So that is to the good. But that said, I think that there's a broader accountability question which the military is not going to be able to answer, because this is being driven by the Justice Department and the White House. And that broader set of questions, I know Human Rights First has spent an enormous amount of time trying to grapple with this, is it doesn't really matter how good your JAG officers are and how much good faith everyone has if you have a everything is war paradigm. Because if everything is war and Al-Qaeda and its associates and their associates and rabbits, friends and relations are all targetable because they're enemy combatants, that renders that inquiry somewhat meaningless. It's depending on how you define your terms, everybody or nobody is a combatant. And that's not a decision, that's sort of above their pay grade, right? That's coming right out. It started with the Bush administration framing this as a armed conflict with potentially global dimensions, and I don't really think that's been rolled back by the Obama administration. And it can't be the military that rolls that back, because that's in some ways a legal determination. So hard to do. And I guess, question of does the military want to be doing this? You know, the military is not monolithic, and I think that on some level, you know, people join the military because they want to protect and defend the United States. And again, as I said a second ago, it's really hard to be the guy who says, wait, I found a bad guy. You know, and he might do something that hurts the United States. He might strap on a suicide vest, or he might plant an IED, or he might be plotting to blow up the Hoover Dam. Who knows? It's really hard to be the one who says, but we're just gonna leave him alone. You know, I think so much about the training pushes against that. And my husband's an Army officer, and you know, you're trained to go out there and you know, grapple with the enemy if you can. And so on that sense, you know, it's hard to stop. On the other hand, I do think, as I said, there's a lot of unease about it. And I think that there is, I wouldn't say, I don't know if I want to say, and obviously I can't speak for anyone except myself here, but that there is almost as much unease within the military establishment about this perpetual war mode as there is in the NGO community. Although often for different reasons, partly because of the institutional costs for the military itself. But actually, that's so. Now I want to ask you another question, Dave.
Sorry.
But this, I mean, this makes me think of something that's a big theme in your book, Beyond War. Has been what you describe as the over-militarization of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, which is your main focus. And you. Can you talk a little bit about that and the degree to which you think that our current human rights woes are linked to that over-militarization?
The book was this sort of quixotic effort to look at the non-military effort, particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where I spent a lot of time, and I spent a little bit of time in Iraq. But you know, our response to the war on terror, and I think to still reflexively to all of our foreign policy challenges, is military. This number's a bit old, but you know, we spent, I think, roughly 1.2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I did the research for my book, 95% of that went to military operations. 95%. It's just an overwhelming effort. So I looked at, U.S.-funded, development efforts, education efforts, supporting human rights groups in these countries, and it was really a depressing view of a sort of contractor-dependent, Washington-driven effort. And this is totally naive, but I spent all these time around Afghans and Pakistanis that support human rights and are these great moderates who are also targeted by militants and killed. Militants have killed many more Pakistanis than Americans. And it was frustrating to me that we spent all this money and spent an entire decade and did such a poor job of building up those moderates in these countries. I don't like the term moderate. We could talk about this more, but it's very, even back to the Taliban in captivity, the Taliban talked about justice and individual rights, and the Prophet Muhammad, listening to, both sides and going through some sort of process of accountability, of him having shuras. So those values, obviously everyone here supports them, and that's the commitment of this fantastic organization. There's more support for that in the region among average people than I think Americans understand. And I wish our government would more consistently back those values, because we would, and make more of a non-military effort, because I think we would get more support in the region.
So lots of things to pick up on there, but what would that mean with the Taliban? I mean, at multiple points, both the U.S. and the Afghan authorities have reportedly initiated or sought to initiate negotiations with the Taliban, and certainly I know, and I'm not an Afghanistan expert, but I know that many believe that there will have to be some sort of negotiated settlement. And on the one hand, I would love to believe that we could all find common ground in our sort of mutual thirst for justice, right? But on the other hand, gosh, what about the women? What about, with the Taliban, they may talk about justice, but there's some hypocrisy there too, obviously. And is there a way forward, do you think?
I think negotiations are definitely the thing to try. But, and I'm, biased again because of this time in captivity. There are some Taliban that simply want, a say or control of their village or valley, and then there's other ones that are very extreme, that think it's their religious duty to forcibly implement hardline Islamic law across every inch of Afghanistan. I spent hours with one commander saying, what about if in the north, it's a little different than it is in southern Afghanistan, and it can be very conservative in the southern Pashtun areas? And he said, absolutely not. He told me this very disturbing view of God and his judgment of individuals. In fact, it wasn't a judgment of individuals. He said that if there's a village and there's one person sinning in the village, and the other villagers don't stop the sinner, the entire village goes to hell. And God does not judge us as individuals. And that's a very extreme sort of, and I'm not a scholar in Islam, but so there is a terrorist threat. There are Taliban that we can't negotiate with, but we should try to negotiate with them and see if we can split off the more moderate ones from the more extreme ones. Some of my captors absolutely were convinced that there was a global conspiracy by Christians, Jews, and Hindus to obliterate Islam from the face of the earth. That American soldiers were forcibly converting Afghans to Christianity, that Afghan women were being forced to work as prostitutes on U.S. military bases, and no matter what I said, they believed that. So I think we do increase the number of terrorists in some ways, but I do agree that there is a real threat. A threat to us and these moderate Afghans that are proud to be Muslim, but they want to be sort of modern at the same time. They don't want to be dictated to by American soldiers, and they also don't want to be dictated to by jihadists who are going to, force them to pray 5 times a day at gunpoint.
So, going back briefly to the issue of over-militarization, I was talking to, for an article I wrote recently, I interviewed retired Lieutenant General Dave Barno, who's now at the Center for New American Security, and he had a fantastic analogy, which I think really helps capture the dilemma for the White House at this point. And he said the U.S. military has become like Walmart, which is to say, and just like Walmart the store, right? We hate it. It's big. It opens up and it drives out the little mom and pop shops, in this case the State Department, USAID, because it's just so darn big. It can reap these incredible economies of scale. You can tell people where to go, and they don't have the option, unlike at the State Department, of saying, oh, no thanks, I don't want to go to Afghanistan, it's dangerous there, people get kidnapped, people get killed. And so it's so tempting to turn to the military because it's big, it goes where you tell it, and it has a sort of can-do attitude, so even if it doesn't have the faintest idea how to do something, such as promote human rights or develop an agricultural program, it'll say, well, we'll just figure it out. And if worse comes to worse, another story, somebody else, another senior retired military person told me, was Afghan, illustrating this Walmart tendency. It was also in Afghanistan, was the military thought that they needed to help the Afghans reform the agricultural sector, come up with alternatives to opium poppies. They call up the Secretary of Agriculture. They say, can you send us some people who can help work with the Afghans? Secretary of Agriculture, unsurprisingly, says, I've got 2.5 people who aren't already doing something else. I can, lend you one guy half-time for 2 weeks, but that's all I can do. And so the Army scrounges around in its records of reservists and National Guards people, finds folks with some agricultural background, essentially forms an agricultural battalion and sends them over. And on the one hand, is this a good solution? No, these aren't necessarily agricultural development experts. They're random people who happen to have some agricultural experience. On the other hand, the military is the one institution that we have that's sort of capable of marshaling massive human effort and talent, getting them from place A to place B pretty quickly. And so it's always so tempting to turn to them. Is there any way out of that Walmart dilemma where the military does more and more, which means that everybody else gets pushed out of business, which means the military gets bigger and bigger, but maybe does everything less well?
Not that I can think of. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, and this is all about American politics, it's much more politically acceptable and safe to kind of vote for more money for the Pentagon versus talking about the State Department. Have any of you heard of the term economic statecraft? Any hands here? Oh, we got one. Oh, that's pretty good because most people have no idea. That was Hillary Clinton's bold new idea about American diplomacy, which would be a focus on economics. You would look at trade and exports, creating jobs in the U.S., as you were building up economies overseas, including across the Middle East. And there actually are business opportunities. There's a private airline in Indonesia just bought $30 billion worth of Boeing aircraft. No one knows the phrase because it never caught on. And it was, and to her credit, she was very good at trying to change the way the State Department thought and operated, being more dynamic. There's real change going on. I mean, it's a cliche, and you all know this, but globalization is happening, connectivity, the impact of Turkish soap operas across the Middle East and in Afghanistan, changing cultural norms, and technology. I was in Tunisia last year. Young Tunisians are dying to work for American high-tech companies, and the government seems to not know how to harness these interesting things that are going on in terms of entrepreneurship and nonprofits and microloans. It's all lumbering, and it's too much about Washington politics and short-term results. So I don't know a way to change it, but I'm absolutely convinced that there are new groups and methods and economies and technologies that make it possible for more effective, development and advances in human rights. These norms are universal. We talked about this. We talked about it on the phone yesterday. I feel that some people on the American left are like, because George Bush talked about spreading democracy, no one in the Middle East actually wants that, and they don't want American-style democracy, but they do want individual rights and accountable government and human rights, and we should not be shy about that. And the more consistently we back that, I think the stronger our position is in many areas.
So I have this whole long list of other things I want to ask you about, but I also want to give other people a chance to raise questions as well. So why don't we shift at this point and see if there are people sitting in the audience who would like to ask a question. And if not, I'll just keep on talking. Steve.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. That's an impressive presentation, and your background and your experience, especially the 6 months, that's incredible. From your perspective, having spent time in that area of the world, and we're just talking about democracy and human rights, America seems to be fixated with democracy. And frankly, it's not working so well. So I'm not sure that's we're our own best PR department for that. But we seem to focus on that more than human rights, like the right for people to vote and hold their government. It's more about the people's ability to vote for a political leader as opposed to necessarily accountability. And it seems like human rights gets pushed off to the side. From your perspective, if you were consulting or helping shape our policy to improve things in the Middle East, and it came down to, do we want to push democracy or do we want to push human rights? Because frankly, under a malevolent dictatorship, you could have human rights, with an M, not a B. I mean with a B. Benevolent, not malevolent. Like in Singapore, and 20 years ago, human rights were pretty good. No, you didn't chew gum and not forget to flush the toilet, but other than that, it was pretty good. So which one would you, if you had that dichotomy, which one would you push?
I would push. I mean, this is sort of playing with language, and there's cultural differences, but the polling shows a really strong support for individual rights across the Middle East, that people should have the right to assemble, that they should have the right to access to online information, and then this incredibly strong current that you see in in Afghanistan, frankly, and even in this vote in Afghanistan from elders in terms of having U.S. troops stay there, and outside of the Middle East, you see this in Ukraine now, is anti-corruption. People support transparency, and they are sick of corruption. And in the Ukraine, it's a push for European Union membership because they think the EU-mandated judicial reforms will help reduce the corruption in the country. And to me, that's just really positive. That's this idea, again, of global norms. I think you're right. I think we should stay away from the term democracy. I think it's loaded. We're not carrying it out very well here at all. But you talk to Egyptians, and they'll, opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood will say they weren't allowing individual rights. But it's very, very clear in polls that people accept that across the Middle East, that they should have these basic rights, free expression. Women's rights gets more complicated. But I would really try to stand by that more consistently. And my biggest frustration with the administration's response to the Arab Spring, and Susan Rice mentioned Bahrain, is that, if you look at it chronologically, we were slow to back the protesters in Egypt and then did force out Mubarak. We looked the other way in Bahrain and essentially Yemen because it would upset the Saudis. Our alliance with Saudi Arabia, in terms of a specific thing I would look at, it's why are we so closely allied with Saudi Arabia? We're more energy independent than ever. There's real questions about, the form of Wahhabist Islam they've spread, that they're trying to stop it now as well, but it's been a hugely destructive force in Afghanistan. I just think there's much more dynamic countries and regimes in the region, but the administration sort of lurches back and forth between, supporting these uprisings and then looking the other way when it fits our counterterrorism objectives. And I just wish, and in Syria, it's Assad has to go, then it's Assad's chemical weapons has to go, and now we're I'm not sure what our policy is. But anyway, individual rights.
Eileen?
I'm going to take advantage of the intimate audience and ask a political question, which is, I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on how to differentiate President Obama from President Bush, especially in terms of counterterrorism policy. But to the larger question, how do you think their legacies will differ on those issues? And maybe go to the next step. What can President Obama do in the last couple of years to make it clear that he has a distinctly different record?
So my quick answer is Obama differentiated himself from Bush by not mounting large military interventions in the Middle East, and he deserves credit for that. That was absolutely the right approach. But he's gone, I think, just wrong in terms of drone strikes and this whole embrace of the CIA and the covert approach to the war on terror. And he could clean it up by setting some much clearer legal standards for his successor about drone strikes, cyber surveillance. It's a strange thing, but it's just this embrace of secrecy is really troubling.
I agree with that. And it makes me, I feel very sad to say this, that my fear is that if the administration does not change course, that President Obama's legacy is going to be really tainted by our current counterterrorism policies. And I actually don't think they're that hard to fix. Because I do think that the fundamental issue, as David said, is accountability and transparency. I think that the biggest place where we're going wrong right now is that we have this absurd, the most covert operation in history. We have an entire war, in effect, and I would say something that has killed an estimated 4,000 people. I would say qualifies as war-like scale of military and paramilitary operations, which officially we don't really even acknowledge. And although the president, in his speech last May at NDU, did acknowledge for the first time, really publicly acknowledge some of the sort of deep problems, the rule of law problems, the accountability problems, and pledged to undertake an internal process to begin to think about addressing them. I'm not aware of any significant internal action to do just that, but it does seem to me that both on drone strikes, where I think the issue is obviously not drones, it's targeted killing, it's the use of lethal force outside of traditional territorially bounded battlefields, and on some of the NSA surveillance issues, that the big problem is that everything is so shrouded in secrecy that we can say as many times as we want that we're very careful, that we follow the rules, that we abide by the law, but the whole concept of rule of law is undermined if everything is done in secret. Maybe not. There's no way to know, and it does come down to essentially the same argument the Bush administration made, which is trust us, and that is not good enough. And I think history will judge that very harshly. I also, as I said, I don't think it's that hard to fix. I think that there are relatively straightforward, non-judicial accountability mechanisms, blue ribbon commissions, greater compensation, greater clarity on what we regard as the criteria, the legal criteria, et cetera, the factual criteria for evaluating when to do these things. I think that could be done. It's hard, but not impossible. So if my plea really to the administration would be, take this seriously. This is the kind of thing that may seem right now like only a group of NGO agitators and cares about this stuff, but this is what the history books, I think, are going to judge very harshly if we don't change it.
Hi, Dixon Osborne of Human Rights First. Both of you expressed. Hi, Dixon Osborne at Human Rights First. Both of you expressed concern about perpetual war. And Rosa, you talked that there are institutional reasons why our armed forces are opposed to being trapped in permanent war. David, you talked about the backlash that citizens in Afghanistan and Pakistan talk about with it. How do we change the political conversation about this as we end combat operations in Afghanistan in 2014, but in light of the fact that you have Senator Feinstein and Representative Rogers saying just recently that the threat environment that we face continues to be at the highest level?
I think we shift more to talking about supporting our allies in the region. There is a threat still to Afghans. I think many people in the U.S. I think don't want to keep a training force in Afghanistan for 10 years. But it's just a different perspective that there is a threat there, but it's much more effective to have people in the region confronting it. It's their nation, it's their culture, it's their religion. In the end, it's going to be moderate Muslims that are going to marginalize jihadists, not American soldiers. So I guess ending our perpetual war and recognizing that we do have allies in the region. And back to the earlier question, our hypocrisy is what infuriates people so much and turns people against us so much in the region. Again, where we talk about accountability and justice and trial by jury and then essentially assassinate people without publicly discussing it. So maybe it's a little confused, but I agree. There is a threat, but this perpetual American war that only Americans can solve and only America can deal with is a recipe for disaster.
I also think our language is really muddy and confused. There are lots of threats to the United States, and there are lots of threats to United States citizens. But the response to, and this goes back to discussion of over-militarization, not every threat needs to be treated as an act of war, and that's a discretionary policy decision. I actually don't even think it's really a legal decision most of the time. I think it's a policy call. I think that we can say, yes, there is a threat of criminal terrorist acts, and some of those criminal terrorist acts may require some degree of the use of lethal force in response and may require some involvement of the military, but that doesn't mean that we need to define it as an eternal state of armed conflict with an eternally morphing, changing, evolving enemy that could be anywhere, anytime, and thus rendering anyone, anywhere, anytime potentially subject to being treated as a combatant and targetable under the laws of war by virtue of their identity, their status. That I think the president could change, and that's a leadership question. I think if he were willing to say, and I'm not super optimistic about this, but I think if he were willing to say, when we withdraw combat troops from Afghanistan, to say, the war is over, the armed conflict is over. That does not mean that there is no threat. There is a threat. That does not mean that we will never again use military force to respond to that threat if it is needed, but we will switch to a self-defense framework and away from a war framework, and that I think in turn has a higher standard, a set of higher legal standards. So I don't think it is impossible to do. But I think it would take a willingness to go out on a political limb. And I also think, unfortunately, that we may continue to have perpetual war, but we cannot have a perpetual panel because a sign has been held up saying end. And so on that note, I hope that we can also bring an end to the perpetual war. But David, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.